Regarding the midterm grades, thought that might get people's attention. We're doing the makeup midterm right now during this period. So presumably we may have all the grades in by the end of the day today or tomorrow, in which case I'll see if we need a curve and how much of one. And when that happens, you'll know. So just hold tight for a little while. The other thing is there were a couple of glitches with Canvas you may have noticed. Originally, Cowspiracy wasn't uploaded. That was my fault, but I quickly did upload it. And there's a little glitch now with all of the forums where you are doing your comments. They have the right dates. They will close normally. So like the Cowspiracy and Wasted one will close at the end of this week, midnight on Sunday. But it says that it will close on February 11th. It's kind of a complicated reason why it says it, but it's a glitch in the system. I'm trying to work out with them how to correct it. But all you need to know is even though every forum from here on out says it will close on the 11th, they are all open and will close when they should in their respective weeks. So, okay. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A for today. But there were a couple left over from last time, and as usual, I'll start with those. Yeah, good. So first one, I get this question every term, and I never know how to answer it. So let me read it to you. You give us all these examples of what we can do, but what are things that you do in your own life to reduce your personal carbon footprint? And I never know how to answer this one, because on the one hand, if I answer it, and I'm tempted to a little bit anyhow, people might think that I'm like virtue signaling about how great I am, the things I do. And I guarantee you people will go online and then say that I'm doing that. But if I don't answer the question, then people will say, yeah, but you're not really walking the talk. You're saying all this, you're encouraging us to do all this, but what are you actually doing? So first, I'll do a few things, I guess. So transportation is one, and this is where it's not much virtue signaling, because you'll notice my bike isn't here. Normally I do the 20-mile round trip commute from Santa Barbara on my bike, but today, as I've noted that my family has gotten down to just one car now, I had to take the car because I had to take my daughter to the orthodontist this morning. So I'm trying to consolidate my trips doing that. But the other thing about transportation is I took part in something 2016 called the Flying Less Petition, where faculty across the planet said that they would either fly less or stop flying. And I have, in fact, not flown since 2016. And this is an issue because professors are expected to go to conferences to deliver talks there. I only will do it remotely. I'll only do keynotes remotely, and that means I don't get to do it as much. But to both of these things, I should note that, as I keep saying, part of the answer is trying to do things not just individually, but collectively. So with the flying thing, I inaugurated way back in 2016 a model of not traveling to conferences, doing conferences that we called them NCN, nearly carbon neutral conferences, and it would allow us to stage conferences remotely. And of course, that all stepped up dramatically during COVID. And the other thing regarding transportation, like the bike, as I've mentioned, I am the chair of the transportation committee on campus. So we work on putting in more bike trails, more bike infrastructure, things of that sort. We also work with the MTD regarding mass transit. And, we are the largest now, UCSB is the largest customer of the Santa Barbara Transit, the bus company, and they do a lot to work with us, including things like introduce microtransit. What else can I say? Yeah, I used to be vegan for like 5 years. And when my daughter was born, it got really tough to do that. So I kind of laxed into vegetarianism. And then when she was 5, she declared she wanted to be a vegetarian. So in solidarity, I'm a vegetarian with her now. So I still have dairy. I had a cheese and bean burrito last night. Also, I grew up on a farm, so we don't have a very large lot down in Santa Barbara, but I'm really into urban farming. So we have 52 raised beds where we grow as much as we can. I have one last chicken. We had a number of chickens, but they've passed away. And I think 20 odd fruit trees and all. So you may have gathered, I'm just noticing the way I dress, that I try to be as minimalist as possible. pair of shoes I'm wearing. I think I have 3 pairs of shoes now, but these are almost 10 years old. They've been rebuilt 3 different times, so I'm sort of keen on all that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm not going to go on and on. If someone wants me to go on and on, say it next time, and I will do it. But that's it. And again, all these things are imperfect that I do. And there's a great book out there called "We Are All Climate Hypocrites Now," and I think we all have to confront that fact that in our personal lives we are. And hey, especially in wealthy countries like the United States, people that are fortunate enough to have the kind of lifestyle we have in Santa Barbara, we're all climate hypocrites now. And I think that's it. And the key to it is to try to do things collectively to address the problem. And I was very happy when that book came out that it actually referenced our nearly carbon neutral conference model here. So anyhow, next statement. I'm glad I got that over. I never liked that question. I was wondering if getting rid of diesel cars completely would help more than electric cars. So this person really paying attention to Project Roll Down, saying electric cars wouldn't help that much. Diesel cars, but especially diesel vehicles, are a huge problem, and they need to get out quickly, very quickly. And that's an issue because the larger vehicles we have, tractor trailers, freight trains, things like that, are all principally diesel. They need to convert as much as possible to electric, which high-speed electric rail and all could do that. Another question I get a lot, I think people always ask questions sort of close to home at UCSB. So next question, you mentioned that food waste is a huge problem contributing to the climate crisis. Absolutely is. And this brought up a thought that our own dining commons do not allow us to take food out of the building. I would assume that's because of this rule that we as a campus are producing tons, literally tons of food waste. How can we as students combat this or stand up to this rule? Yeah, it's. I can tell you that because I'm also the co-chair of the Chancellor Sustainability Committee, which does all things environmental on campus, that there have been great efforts made and achievements made with the dining commons, things that you may not know about. In fact, if you go online, I don't know how you'd put this in your browser, but maybe UCSB dining commons small plates. We've shifted to smaller plates. I don't know if people have noticed those. And that means that there's less food waste insofar as people before, and there's actually a Vox documentary on this, mini documentary on it on YouTube, which is coming out of UCLA. And the larger plates meant that people were putting more food on, not eating it, throwing more away. Believe it or not, by going to smaller plates, people put less food on, tend to eat more of the food, and the bottom line, have less food waste. But people should absolutely try to do what they can. I think I mentioned someone in this class actually asked me before in an email if we could get rid of beef on the campus altogether. And that would be absolutely terrific. And that would have to be not only in the dining commons, but even places like over in the Arbor where there's a subway and all, we would have to do that. But then to answer the question, what can you do as a student? I would say get involved. Get involved with like EAP, the Environmental Affairs Board on campus, CalPERG, make this a priority because you doing one thing, again, will do absolutely nothing. But you get enough people together, I think it could happen. And maybe not going like meat-free or waste-free in the dining commons, but reducing it a lot. So the low-hanging fruit there would be beef, of course, and thinking about how we can, because this person actually embedded in this question was an answer that you're not allowed to take food outside of the commons. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all because it's either wasted or if you can't take it out. So that would be a great change to look for. I mean, I'm assuming they're doing that because they don't want people to take a lot of food out. But on the other hand, yeah. Staying on the topic of food waste, someone said, I used to work at Cheesecake Factory and could not believe the amount of food they would typically waste, and other supplies such as toilet paper, they would make me throw away toilet paper with half of the roll on it. Well, I understand that a lot of the food waste problem is a consumer level. How much are restaurants to blame for this? Yeah, a lot. So I mentioned in the United States, it's at consumer or near consumer level, so it's consumers for sure, but also restaurants and places you're buying food from, like supermarkets and all. Yeah, that's an absolutely a great question, and I think for that you'd have to get involved with a larger organization like 350.org or something. to address this. And again, if people make enough of an issue of it, something will happen. And it really comes down to communication, because if you think about it, how much of this do we really know about? You don't really know about the waste that takes place behind the scene at a place like Cheesecake Factory, or you're encouraged to think that, nah, you should just not take food out of the food commons. That's the way it is. None of these things have to be that way. They're all cultural practices that can change. Last question. Following the third industrial revolution, with the advent of genetically modified food, that's GMOs, and the mass production of nitrogen-based fertilizer, people laughed at Malthusian ideology. So this is Thomas Malthus, you may know. I'll explain what it is in a minute. Do you foresee disasters in the future like Malthus predicted, or do you think that we will continue to innovate to solve this problem? Is our population accelerating too fast for that innovation to have a noticeable impact? So Thomas Malthus, writing 200 years ago, predicted that there would be a problem, that population would grow, but the planet would not be able to provide for that population sufficiently, at which case there'd be sort of disaster occurring. This person notes that the so-called third industrial revolution, sometimes called the Green Revolution of the 20th, changed all that. And it did. And it was through technological innovation, through all sorts of things. But to give you one example, wheat, at the beginning of the 20th century, a wheat plant compared to a wheat plant at the end of the 20th century, when we had grown wheat through traditional, open pollination, as well as hybridization, and then genetically modified, wheat became 10 times more productive in the 20th century, in part because of this person who's done their homework also knows of nitrogen-based fertilizer. The question is, can we keep it up? And it will depend on where the population ultimately lands on this planet, and it looks like it may hit around 10, maybe 12 million or so, 12 billion with a B. It could go more, it could be like 15. There is no problem here at all, going back to what we were just talking about, eliminate beef, and there's more than enough food to feed everyone, because it's not going to be used to feed animals, but to feed people, and it's more than enough. But yeah, so that's it. This revolution, this green revolution, is deeply problematic because of how it's effaced local growing practices across the planet that people had for centuries. Also, its reliance on things like nitrogen-based fertilizer, which is disastrous, rather than doing things organically and all. So the answer to that is it probably is not going to be the problem. It could be, but we still need to radically modify the way we grow food, which leads us to our discussion today. And I note that it's an interesting book you can read by Jonathan Safran Foer, not the person you might imagine who would have weighed in on this. Published a book entitled "We Are the Weather: Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast." And he argued that each of us should adopt a plant-based diet if we want to save the planet from catastrophic climate change. So this is very much, you kind of get the impression that Jonathan Safran Foer watched Cowspiracy, which came out a few years before, began writing this book. Yeah, but before we talk about that further, kind of a related question, let's get to our first eye clicker poll. And no judgment here, as I said. So, how do you eat? I'm just curious. This is anonymous, and I'm actually kind of like statistically, I'm wondering how you compare to what we know about the rest of the country or people in your demographic, your age. So, are you vegan, vegetarian, flexitarian? You may know that phrase. You eat meat less, or you're conscious about the fact that you eat meat and you try to have smaller portions or eat less, or do you eat what was really a normal diet in the West, in the US especially, daily portions of meat, maybe meat multiple times a day? Or are you really big on animal products, something like Atkins and paleo, where you eat a lot? So I'm actually anxious to see this. Results are, most people eat a normal diet. That's why I called it normal. Very few people are vegan. So if there are 800 people fewer in the room right now, less than 2%. That's actually lower than the national average. Vegetarian more, but again, like 6% or so. Flex is increasingly something, and maybe we'll talk about that today, that people do. And Atkins actually is, well, roughly 3 times larger than vegan. So all really interesting. Okay, let me close that. Okay. So, as we've seen, according to Project Drawdown, most comprehensive plan ever to reverse global warming, which we read. The number one thing that we can do to roll back global greenhouse gas emissions doesn't involve wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, or any sort of similar technology. Instead, as noted in the last lecture, it's a cultural change, and so many of these things are cultural changes. We need to waste less food, the number one thing. Number two thing, to switch to largely plant-based diets. It's almost incomprehensible the amount of equivalent gases of CO2 that would save 155 billion tons of CO2. And again, if you've already done the reading, that's scenario one of Project Drawdown. Just to restate what I said there, but hit the highlights of it. Globally shifting from fossil fuels to electricity generated by solar panels, photovoltaic, will roll back less than half that amount of emissions. So solar is absolutely wonderful. I have it on my house. It makes a lot of sense, but it's not nearly as big as the food system thing. And electric vehicles, far, far less than 10% of what a food change would do. We should, of course, work on exploring a variety of technologies to reduce our emissions. But the thing here to keep in mind is you always have to look at the relative impact. So like LED light bulbs, yeah, good thing, but not much at all. Electric cars, yeah, in some ways a good thing. Electric vehicles are a good thing. But food is the main thing, which is why we're taking it up today with Cowspiracy. Agriculture is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And then the irony is that worldwide, between a third and half of all the food that we produce is wasted. That's the real tragedy of it. And in talking about Malthus and the idea of, how could we feed the planet, or will we not be able to feed everyone on the planet? The food's just wasted. I mean, the number of people that are food insecure, and I'll give the actual numbers in a few slides, is billions of people, and it's completely unnecessary. The same amount of greenhouse gases that are released in producing 1 pound of beef, I said this on the very first day of class, is the equivalent of 30 pounds of lentils. Now, also a great source of protein. So it is just dramatic how inefficient what we're doing is. And you can think about that, feed one person, beef, or feed 30 people lentils. And that's the decision that we've made. It doesn't sound as glamorous as something like a self-driving electric car. People talk about these things all the time, but it's more than 10 times better for the planet. And just to underscore, it might sound then this is easy, right? I mean, making a self-driving electric car, all sorts of technologies and things we have to figure out how to do. So this should be really simple. But cultural changes are not simple. Just by making a car electric is not simple. Cultural changes are really difficult to engender. And we'll talk about those in a minute. Because especially eating food is very central to our cultural identity, who we are, who we think of ourselves as. It might have to do with deep cultural identity, that, wherever your people are from, whatever part of the planet, you have that diet, it's part of who you are. But, if we're going to address the climate crisis, we have to think about this. And again, not just in a personal way. Yeah, you can make a personal change. You can join the 11 people in the room that are eating a plant-based diet. Or more importantly, we can focus on how to shift away as a culture. And the first thing has to be beef. So Cowspiracy is all about beef. That's why it's not a conspiracy, but a cowspiracy. So this has been out a while, and honestly, this may be the last year I show this film because it's getting a little old, has some shortcomings. I may switch it up and have the alternate film, wasted BR film, but let me just give you an overview as the filmmakers put it out. Cowspiracy, subtitled The Sustainability Secret, is a groundbreaking feature-length environmental documentary following intrepid filmmaker Kip Anderson as he uncovers the most destructive industry facing the planet today and investigates why the world's leading environmental organizations are too afraid to talk about it. Yeah, so right off the bat, I quoted this because there's a problem here. It's saying that the beef industry or the cattle industry more general, because remember this produces a lot of milk too. So in other places like India, they have an awful lot of cows too, but they don't raise them for beef principally, but it's principally for milk. So either way. Um, they call it the most destructive industry facing the planet today. That's not true. The fossil fuel industry is bigger than the beef industry by a long shot. We're going to talk about why they make this claim, but they do make it. They know it's wrong. They continue. Last time I checked Kip Anderson's website for this, that statement was still there. So that's a problem, and we'll talk about the nature of that as a problem. Let me just read you a little more from their publicity stuff. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of deforestation, water consumption, pollution, and is responsible for more greenhouse gases than the transportation industry. Well, that's true. And is a primary driver of rainforest destruction, species extinction, habitat loss, topsoil erosion, ocean dead zones, and virtually every other environmental ill. Yet it goes on almost entirely unchallenged. Yeah, so problems again with this statement. Virtually every other environmental ill. No, that's not at all right. Some of it's right. Deforestation in the rainforest, yeah, that's happening in places like the Amazon basin in this part of the world, and that's because the rainforest is being cut down to either make direct pasture for beef or to raise soybeans for beef. On the other hand, rainforest destruction, as we saw in Before the Flood, that Leonardo DiCaprio film, is not happening in Indonesia for that reason. Primarily, it's to do things like grow palm trees to produce palm oil, which is not animal agriculture in this sense. So you have to be very careful with the facts, which is why I like this film, because it actually it makes us think about this question about how honest we need to be. But on the other hand, it can be misleading. So I right here note that he gets a few of his facts wrong. And the first, he goes and says that, I think he says 51% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from the beef industry or the livestock industry. That's wrong. It's more like 15%. And again, he continues to make that. Why does he make it? Well, there was a WHO, World Health Organization study that came out during the aughts that said that. And they quickly realized it came under fire, and they quickly realized it was wrong and retracted it. That happened before Cowspiracy was ever made. But Kip Anderson likes to latch on to that and say that that's the fact, but it's not. No one believes that fact nowadays, except people that Kip Anderson has convinced to do it. And so I really want to throw this out, and I think someone will address it in the comments. What do you make of this fact? Does it help? Right? I mean, if you've watched this, or people watch it and they say, this is such a huge issue, it's 50% of the greenhouse gas problems, we should really stop eating beef. Or does it, undercut the credibility of the whole project? In other words, you could make this whole film and just said the term 15%, and it's still huge. No, it's not as big as the fossil fuel industry, but that's like what almost 1/6 of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's still a really big deal. Unfortunately, people who are in the business of attacking this, climate change deniers, love this film because it's just wrong. And they use Kip Anderson as an example of a climate alarmist, because he's out there bald-faced lying to make it sound worse, and it's not true, and he's just getting everyone upset more than they'd have to be. That's the argument of climate change deniers, and they want to say he's the quintessential climate alarmist. He's out there lying, telling us there's a bigger problem than it is, when if you look at the facts, it's clear he's absolutely wrong. So there's a problem here. But on the other hand, it's an interesting film. You may know or about this, the idea of largely eating a plant-based diet. By the way, a couple people have emailed me that they're having trouble with people talking around them. So people are talking, you may not realize it. I mean, I can even hear people up here talking, but people have been very frustrated and they've asked me what I can do, and I don't know what I can do, and then just keep saying, please don't talk if you would. The idea here is, it may come as a surprise. While how we eat is important, switching to a largely plant-based diet is not the big thing. So if you just watch Cowspiracy, you might think, in terms of food systems, in terms of generally what we eat, the key to it is switching to a largely plant-based diet. But you already know that's not the biggest thing. Food waste is far less food. And that's why the alternate film that we had this week, which if you've already watched Cowspiracy, I think Wasted is a really great film because it's all about food waste and what we can do about that. And that's why being freegan can be even more important than being vegan. So I'm gathering you don't know what a freegan is. Most people don't. This is hardly surprising, as the word just entered the English language a few years ago. So the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, notes a freegan is a person who eats discarded food, typically collected from the refuse of shops or restaurants for ethical or ecological reasons. So this could be dumpster diving, but more likely what freegan is when like supermarkets have food that let me just switch. I think I have a couple examples of it. It doesn't sound very appealing, right? But here's one of the things, enormous amount of food is thrown away at restaurants and at, stores. So in California, if you see a carton of eggs and one of the eggs is broken, then what will happen is that has to, by law, be taken off of the shelf because it can spread disease and all, and then thrown away. And what freegans do is they coordinate with restaurants and supermarkets and any place that has extra food, and they take that food. Maybe like a carton of eggs because one egg is broken. It may be that the best by date is past and they're getting rid of it. And freegans then eat that food or distribute that food. And those that are very coordinated do it all online. So they actually coordinate who's going to pick up food, who's going to bring it around. And if you think about it, this is better than being vegan, even in terms of a small environmental footprint, because the food that you're eating isn't contributing anything more to the climate crisis because it would be thrown away. And that's why the best possible diet you can have would be not 100% vegan, but 100% freegan, if you could do that. It sounds like dumpster diving and like a fringe activity, probably. But one of the people that we're going to be we're going to see a film about him. It's a friend of mine, Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory right down the road in Pasadena. He's largely a freegan. And he has a small group in Pasadena where they live, and they collect food from local stores, and then either people eat it or they distribute it to people in need who are food insecure to eat it as well. So yeah, something to think about if you're looking for another eco way to eat, not vegan, but freegan. So Wasted is our alternative documentary this week. It's on food waste, and to give it a fair play, here's how it's described by its filmmakers. Wasted, the story of food waste, aims to change the way people buy, cook, recycle, and eat food through the eyes of the chef heroes. And yes, if you watch this documentary, the heroes in there are chefs and other people. Audiences see how the world's most influential chefs make the most of every kind of food, transforming what most people consider scraps into incredible dishes that create a more secure food system. Wasted exposes the criminality of food waste and how it's directly contributing to climate change, and shows us how each of us can make small changes, all of them delicious, to solve one of the greatest problems of the 20th century. So one thing that this documentary is about is, and I already mentioned things like if you just eat like turnips, just eat the root part of it and you throw away the top, that's horrible because you're throwing away really, great edible food. And a whole new generation of chefs are figuring out how to cook with all those things. You can even, if you eat meat, for example, eat things like this in Santa Barbara. There's a place downtown that has tacos that are made of different parts of animals that we normally throw away. I don't eat meat myself, so it does skeeve me, but maybe not you. You can get a taco with cow eyes in it. So the eyes are what you're eating, which normally get thrown away. By the way, none of that really does get thrown away in an industrial system, insofar as all those sorts of parts that people don't want to eat get ground up. And when you buy dog food and it says, beef and beef byproducts, it's things like eyes and all. But it is the case that, for a long time, people have made delicacies out of things like, cow's tongue. Eating tongue as a meat is popular in some cuisines. And what's really happening now, aside from eating meat, with all sorts of food, these chefs are bringing back things that really were once a big deal. So you may know, of course, watermelon. People just eat the red meat of the watermelon, but the watermelon, rind itself can be pickled. It's a delicacy in parts of the U.S., pickled watermelon rind. What these folks are doing is trying to figure out how can we use all the food that we grow, and also food that is, slightly scarred and all. So you may know, traditionally, historically, for thousands of years, even mentioned in the Hebrew Testament of the Bible, there are people called gleaners, and there are actually laws that still allow it in California, that after a harvest has been made, so industrial harvest goes through and it gets all the food that it can out of a field, then people are allowed to go and collect whatever was left behind. So, for example, with strawberries, industrially, when people pick strawberries, they only pick the nice looking ones. If there's some that are discolored or have spots on them, they literally leave them there, leave apples on trees, things like that. Well, gleaners have come by, and they're freegans, basically, and they come by and pick that. And they have for thousands of years, and it's been perfectly legal to do that because the food is being wasted. So this documentary is all about that. Curious if you're keeping up with the weekly readings. I've asked this question before. And documentaries, yes, kind of, a little bit. Really trying to get a feel for where people are after the midterm and if people are falling behind. So good. 1 and 2 are basically there. A little behind is not so bad. Really behind is a problem, but not that many folks. But hey, good to identify this as an issue now, because you have time to catch up on everything before the midterm, before the final exam happens, and the final exam is not cumulative, so you can't really be that far behind at this point, I hope. Okay, so next. So I want to go through what Project Drawdown says, to burrow into it a little more. I know that was principally for the last lecture, but there are a few things that you will have read about if you read into Project Drawdown on food systems. Shifting to a diet rich in plants is a demand-side solution to global warming that runs counter to the meat-centric Western diet on the rise globally. And by the way, just to pause on that, it is on the rise globally. So all sorts of low to moderate income countries that are becoming wealthier and adopt the Western lifestyle, the quote, American way of life. With that comes eating lots of meat. And all over the planet, meat consumption is going up significantly. But that diet comes with a significant, steep climate price tag, 1/5 of global emissions. So if cattle were their own nation, they would be the world's 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So I can't help but repeat myself. If cattle were their own nation, they would be the 3rd largest producer of greenhouse gases, right behind China and the US. So if you wonder why I keep focusing on cattle, on beef, and this is why. It's absolutely huge. And I mean, right off the bat, the US and China have huge, huge carbon footprints. The US, mainly because we just consume stuff so relentlessly. China, mainly because they produce, but half of their carbon footprints comes from producing stuff, most of it's consumed by the rest of the world. And China also has 4 times our population. But even though they produce a little more greenhouse gases than we do now, they still can't compete with us per capita. Virtually no other country can compete with us per capita, except a couple, maybe small ones like United Arab Emirates and all, where they also are into supersized, ostentatious life. So Project Drawdown. Bringing about dietary change is not simple because eating is profoundly personal and cultural, but promising strategies abound. Plant-based options must be available, visible, and enticing, including high-quality meat substitutes. Also critical, ending price-distorted government subsidies, such as those benefiting the U.S. livestock industry, so the prices of animal protein more accurately reflects their cost. So it's this last part that I wanted to focus on, the amount of subsidies that we pay for, that you pay for, that anyone paying taxes in the United States pays for, that goes to the livestock industry in the United States. So there are lots of, you'll hear, agricultural subsidies. We have all these agricultural subsidies. Not all of them are to the livestock industry, but a huge amount are. And this means that, any animal product that you buy in the supermarket has a reduced cost because everyone is sharing that cost through taxes and the subsidized animal industry. So more Project Drawdown. It's actually a useful figure here. Plant-rich diets reduce emissions and also tend to be healthier, leading to lower rates of chronic disease. According to a 2016 study, business as usual emissions, we're going to talk about that again and again, that phrase, business as usual, in other words, the status quo, could be reduced by as much as 70% through adopting a vegan lifestyle. But if you're one of those folks that are thinking about it and thinking vegan's a little tough, not to worry, 63% reduction, almost as much with a vegetarian diet, which includes cheese, milk, and eggs. $1 trillion in annual healthcare costs and lost productivity would be saved. Yeah, so I think I mentioned before, if you eat, beef every day and all, you're going to cut your lifespan by at least a year, maybe 2, and have all those related healthcare problems. And by the way, these figures that Project Drawdown is relating are for the industrial food system, and for some, it's if you use an older kind of system, it would work better. So, give an example of eggs. I mentioned that I'm kind of an urban farmer, and we had a number of chickens for a while. If you have backyard chickens, in spite of what Kip Anderson says when he gives that example of backyard poultry and duck production, it's actually very good. And the reason is, and I can attest to this personally, chickens eat what you don't want. So in other words, if you have a cantaloupe, all those seeds you're probably not going to want, you throw them out, chickens eat them, chickens will eat the rind as much as they can. So they're a way of processing wasted part of food that you wouldn't eat. You can compost it and all, but the beauty of something like chickens is they will convert that into highly usable protein in the form of eggs. And if you have just, I don't know, 2, 3, maybe like 3 or 4 chickens, you can provide enough eggs for a whole family. The problem with that backyard production is I've directly experienced is chickens reach the height of their productivity with producing eggs when they're about 2 years old, even a little less. That's why in industrial operations, they kill the chickens then and convert them into meat and sell them in the supermarket. Since I personally can't bring myself to kill the pet chickens in our yard, they have to die off. And as a consequence, we have one that's almost 13 years old that's still alive. But if you did it the way traditionally people have done, feeding chickens just extra, waste and all, it's actually not bad at all for the environment. But people tend not to do that. Finally, quote, Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh has said that making the transition to a plant-based diet may be the most effective way to an individual can stop climate change. Individual action is still important, and as Tay, as he's known. Notes here, it might be the most important thing you can do individually. So if you're going to do individual action, it's great. Although, as Thich Nhat Hanh knew more than anyone else, he actually founded the notion of engaged Buddhism because of his activism on the Vietnam War. He was a Vietnamese monk. Collective activism is where it's at. I take this up further in the pre-recorded lecture they're going to be watching is Are You an Architect of the Future? But I'm curious to hear what people think about it, and I have comments. So typical thing, these are the comments. They're not been paraphrased. Quite a few comments, such as this one. I watched Cowspiracy for the first time last year for around my environmental studies class. I haven't eaten red meat since. So as big a problem as Cowspiracy is, insofar it relates incorrect facts and all, many people, it's been my experience, had response to it like that. And similarly, here's another one. I've officially become vegetarian. While I have a lot of critiques of the film, that's good. It definitely swayed me over to the green side. Yeah. So my friend and colleague, John Foran's professor at UCSB and sociology department. If you're interested in climate and cultural aspects, try to take one of his classes. He's shown, like me, lots and lots of documentaries over the year, but he does something a little different. He does like an exit poll. He has a little forum to see what people think of it. And students responded more positively to Cowspiracy than any other film that he's ever shown. So it's that big. And as a film, it underscores how important education, can be. Many people just don't realize that day-to-day activities like what they eat, how they get around, whether they're eating beef, whether they're getting around in the car, can have profound negative impact on the climate. The good news is, with respect to communication, is that if you make people aware of these facts, and that's the good thing about Cowspiracy, people might right then and there stop and change. And again, going back to Project Drawdown, becoming fully vegan is not, necessary. It's good. 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the world come from cattle, and the problem is in the United States, we consume well over twice the per capita amount of beef than the rest of the planet. So you don't have to become vegetarian, you don't have to become vegan, you don't have to be freegan, you don't even have to be, flex in the sense of all you have to do is just cut out beef. And if, instead of getting a beef burger, you get a turkey burger or something, and that can make all the difference. So next comment. I remember when this film Cowspiracy was released and people talking about it. I was 18 or 19 at the time. I remember not wanting to watch it and continued in a state of ignorance because I was afraid of what the documentary would reveal, and that what I would be told. I didn't want to live in a state of guilt. Terrible, I know. Yeah, I don't think that's that uncommon, or certainly not terrible. It's not unusual. And this is a really essential point, I would argue, as some people are aware of the validity of climate science and further believe that we need to collectively act. But when it comes to personal action and how they would physically change their lives, that's the disconnect problem, right? So there are disconnect problems throughout here. With denial, if you don't believe it is true, but there are people who believe it's true, believe that we have to act and all. But when it comes to kind of, where the rubber hits the ground, that's where the problem is. And the difficulty is these are deeply personal things like eating, right? And it's personal, and it's the culture which you are part of and all. And, it's really a huge issue. The good news, however, if we address this, it can address a whole range of other issues, just like addressing fast fashion can address a social justice issue. And with something like this, animal rights are also an issue. Equitable distribution of food across the planet. We're growing all the food we need for everyone on the planet. No one on this planet needs to be food insecure, let alone starving, and there are. But it can be if we address this issue. But again, first thing is this communication challenge, I think. Yeah. So coming to this class, a consumer-based, animal product heavy and non-minimalist background makes me feel like the bad guy for why the crisis continues, which is why I want to continue to learn about little things that I can change to improve how I live. However, getting rid of meat is tough for someone who is 6'3", 200 pounds, plays a lot of sports. It's kind of hard to ask. I do agree that big corporations need to stop thinking for profit alone and should consider the well-being of the planet. As I won't be cutting meat out of my daily meals, I can agree to be more mindful about what I'm consuming. Yeah, this is a really great point, and I'm a really honest point. I'm glad this person said it. For centuries, we've been told that the only way to be healthy, let alone strong, let alone if you're an athlete, is to eat animal products and principally meat. And if you went back 400 years ago to Shakespeare's time, people would have flat out told you that you would die if you didn't eat animal products, that if you ate a vegan diet, you would die. Now we have obviously a much better understanding of health, and we know that's not the case. In fact, in case you're curious, if you're a vegan, you can get everything possible that you need from your diet, with the exception that, the vitamin B12, you should probably take a supplement. And that's it. And of course, now we can get, regular blood tests to see where you are, if you have like a vitamin D deficiency or something like that. This comment sounds very intuitive, but I suggest if you think this way, you watch a documentary, and I would show it, but we just don't have enough time. I'll see if I can't put it on our Gaucho cast for people who don't have Netflix, but it does come from Netflix and it's called The Game Changers. And I just checked this morning to make sure it's still there, and it is. And what this is about is professional athletes, world-class athletes, in some case, Olympic athletes that have switched to not only largely plant-based, but vegan diets. And they're doing it for yet another reason. So they're not doing it for animal rights. They're not doing it for social equity and make sure everyone on the planet has food. They're not doing it for the climate. They're doing it to become more competitive athletes. And the studies are coming back, and they're proving that it really does work. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's in the film, notes that, because professional bodybuilder for a long time, I ate a lot of meat. They showed these commercials selling the idea that real men eat meat, serious man food. But you got to understand, that's marketing. That's not based on reality. So it's a great documentary because you meet a range of competitive athletes, and these are people who are, need svelte bodies, like, triathletes, competitive bicyclists. The people are amazingly bulked up. So like bodybuilders, weightlifters, Olympic weightlifters. You meet the gold medal Olympic weightlifter here, football players, heavyweight boxing champions, and they're not buying this rhetoric that meat is better. And again, studies have proven that largely plant-based is better. This documentary has come under fire, just like Cowspiracy. Some of the data is cherry-picked, but the simple matter is you can be very healthy, and you can even be a competitive athlete, and maybe a more competitive athlete, by eating a largely plant-based or entirely plant-based diet. Just throwing it out there. Next comment. Another point to bring up is that people just might not know the amount of emissions agriculture produces. Honestly, I didn't know about it until I watched this documentary. So how are people who don't have an education on the environment supposed to know to stop eating meat? It goes back to the narrator questioning why no environmental group has shined a light on the issue. We need to get the word out there and help people ease into an environmental way of living. We can't just expect them to do this themselves without the right type of guidance, education. Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And again, we keep coming back to education. We saw it with that book, why scientists disagree about global warming. Sorry, I think I have it wrong. But fossil fuel industry and its affiliates funded this book to get out there to create a new generation of climate change deniers by educating children that way. As this person notes, the flip side is people need to be educated. And I would argue it has to start K through 12 with it. Cowspiracy has done an awful lot. So as flawed a film as it is, it was a popular film. It reached a lot of people. And just as a postscript to it, that groups like the Sierra Club are attacked there by Kip Anderson, but they've since got the message out too. If you go to the Sierra Club's website or any of the groups that Kip Anderson, pokes fun at, they're all getting the message out there now. Another way of doing it, and this is education, but in a broader sense, is happening across the world. But unfortunately, it's just yet another example that the US is not leading this effort. And in this case, the one I'm about to give you is Denmark. So you all know if you go buy food in a store, there's a label on it that has the nutritional value of it. So you know how many calories it is, how much protein, fiber, or whatever. That's mandatory. That wasn't always there. It was really in the 1970s that the EPA got involved, and remarkably, it wasn't until the 1990s that it became absolutely required on all food, or unless it's like not packaged. And you can see there's still issues because if you go into restaurants, you can't always get that data. You can get it for like large chains like McDonald's and all have it, but others don't. But anyhow, Denmark is starting a new labeling campaign. And in addition to having the label on there telling you the nutritional breakdown of that food, it will have another label telling you the environmental cost of that food, what it will cost, what it actually costs to have that 1 pound of beef, how many greenhouse, the total weight of greenhouse gas emissions. And then you can hold up that package of beef and that package of lentils, and you can compare the two and decide which you want to buy, not just for what's good for your body, which the present labels do, but what's good for the planet. So that would be a way of educating people about the carbon footprint of all foods, because all foods would have to have that on there. By the way, of course, this is being fought by all sorts of industries, but in a country like Denmark, where it is a democracy and all, but where it's a very strong central government, they are making sure that that's going to happen regardless of the pushback they get from different industries. And so really what you need here, like to get to this person's question of like, how do we get the word out? Again, you need collective activism, you need government interaction, you need to put people in office who are going to do things like they're doing in Denmark and other countries. We don't have enough people in office to do those sorts of things. And you also need people to think of things like that. So it's an incredibly, I wouldn't have thought of it right away, but you may know that voluntarily there's certain brands that do this now. And I'm not sure, and so going back like to fast fashion, I think I mentioned it, but I'm not sure if like Reformation is still doing it, but these clothing manufacturers would tell you how many pounds of CO2 were used to create that garment, were emitted making that garment, how much water was used for it and all. The problem is that's all voluntary and it's not checked by anybody. So they could be inflating or distorting or maybe just making an honest mistake. What you really need is a program like this in place, not just with food, but with so many things that we buy, so many options that we have, so, how much emissions would have when you get into a car compared to get into an airplane, compared to take a bike, compared to take an e-bike. By the way, a little trivia, if you're looking for the absolute most efficient way to get around on this planet, it used to just be a regular multi-speed bicycle, assuming you have flat roads, and we have them all across the planet now. But people have run the numbers and decided that e-bikes are actually better, because if you fuel them renewably, the amount of energy you get, like from solar panels to power your battery, has less carbon emissions than the food you would need to eat to have the energy to do the pedaling too. So a hybrid where you're eating food and pedaling with that energy and also using renewables for your battery is maybe the most efficient way of getting around. So the other documentary this week, Wasted, and this is the next comment, highlighted the lack of consideration humanity takes regarding food waste. To accommodate our population growth since the Industrial Revolution, humans have mastered the mass production of food. Absolutely right. humans have ended up producing more food than we actually eat. One shocking statistic that came from the documentary was that 10 million tons of produce goes unharvested every year. Yeah, so if you watch this documentary, you'll see that some of that food doesn't even get harvested, in part because of production conditions and all, but partly the food is just going bad in the fields and all. Um, yeah, this whole notion, which I talked about before, this is the so-called green revolution, which happened during the 20th century. And what that means is, you're using fertilizers, using pesticides, you're using herbicides, which kill plants, not animals. You're using artificial irrigation and modern varieties of plants, high yield plants, and the highest yield are often either hybridized or genetically modified. And that has brought things way up. And California is one of the world leaders in this sort of efficient production because we bring all the water in, we can irrigate at a very controlled level, and we use all these things if you're not buying organic. And that's why population is able to, keep up with what Malthus was worried about, that it wouldn't be able to keep up. So we've increased it dramatically. And that's why it's only because of doing all that that the population was able to grow on this planet of human beings from 3 billion when I was born to 8 billion today. If we were using traditional agricultural practices without fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, irrigation, it just would not be possible. And especially if we're using like heirloom variety plants that wouldn't necessarily have that high yield. So it's not necessarily a good thing, and many people have written about this, that it would have been better if we kept a smaller population and used traditional agricultural practices. We might think, though, because of all this, I mean, it's an astonishing thing, this green revolution. That's why they call it that. People got Nobel Prizes for taking a role in it. But, we waste so much food, and again, we're wasting a third to a half of it, that people are still starving. Every night, 1 in 9 people on the planet goes to bed hungry. And with respect to starvation, every 10 seconds, a child dies somewhere on this planet because of starvation. In spite of the Green Revolution, every 10 seconds. I don't know how many children have died since I started talking about this. You could do the math, it would be very depressing. So that's the sad thing. Now, we do grow enough food that everyone on the planet need not be hungry, but we're doing two things that are a problem. One, we're wasting a third to half of it, and two, we're feeding vast amounts of it to animals rather than to human beings. Yeah. And if you think about that, if the world's wasting a third of its food, if you do the math, that amounts to about 1.3 billion tons of food a year, and that would be enough to feed 3 billion people. So food waste is huge. That's why I mentioned before, if we just shift away from beef, we could feed billions of people. Here's another thing you can do to feed billions of people: stop wasting the food that we waste. Next comment. The film Wasted was one of the my more enjoyed films thus far. I'm always so interested in what I can do personally, and using my food to the fullest is something I never considered. Most people haven't. The fact that it takes 25 years for a head of lettuce to fully decompose in a landfill is wild, and also, I would add, correct. This fact was absolutely surprising to me and has already made me rethink what I would do with the food waste in the future. But seeing all of the solutions available to fix these problems, I was upset with our government again. The system is changing. It's charging people for the food waste they throw away. We see in Korea is a great way to do it. If you enjoyed and benefited by watching Cowspiracy, you might also want to watch Wasted, the story of food waste. Yeah, so first off, I second that at the end. So what this person is talking about, the film Wasted looked at South Korea. And in 2013, they put a compulsory food waste program nationwide into effect. Prior to that, only 2% of food waste was recycled through composting or other means. So just 2%. But after they put this program into effect, that number dramatically increased to 95%. Why this person says they're upset is, why isn't our government doing things like that? Why don't we have a nationwide program to deal with food waste? And by the way, they look at South Korea as an instance here of where you can do all sorts of things with it. So if you still want to eat animal protein, well, okay. One of the things they do in South Korea is they take food waste that can be fed to pigs, and instead of throwing it away, they channel that not to composting operations, but to feeding pigs. Pigs don't have the same sort of stomachs that cows and sheep do, so they don't produce anywhere near as much methane, and they're being fed by waste. So there are all sorts of things that you can do, but as this person rightly says, we're not doing it. And the beauty of putting a program like this into effect, requiring this food waste to be used, is that smart entrepreneurial people will come in and come up with opportunities. So you see in the film, one is how to use food waste to create more food in the sense of pork. If you're wondering where we fit into that, so I mentioned that only right now, and actually it was 2021 that they assessed the program, and only 5% of food waste was winding up in landfills. In the US today, over 90% of food waste winds up in landfills. Almost all of it lines up in landfills. And as this person notes, it's true. Once it's in there, there's no aerobic decomposition taking place. It's all been buried. A head of lettuce can take 25 years or more to decompose. And unfortunately, those landfills are also a big source of methane, because when this food is decomposing this way and not composting, it is releasing methane into the atmosphere. What would it take to shift? Well, yet another example. Here we have it. South Korea came up with it. Kudos to them. Just make it law. Next comment. I heard of Cowspiracy before, but have always been afraid to watch it because I thought it would be another source of vegan propaganda, where they show gruesome videos from slaughterhouses. Thankfully, I was wrong, and the film takes a much more logical than emotional approach. I think this tactic makes the movie much more digestible to the general public that isn't already vegan or vegetarian. It's an interesting comment. First, because this notion that there's vegan propaganda out there that's designed to show gruesome slaughterhouse videos. First off, I mentioned the ag gag laws in the US, which Cowspiracy draws attention to, make sure that no one in the US can legally go into a slaughterhouse, take a film and make it public, either by making a documentary or putting it up on YouTube or TikTok or something. That's illegal. And that, of course, is because it shows how powerful the animal product industries are in the United States, that they can get lawmakers to put laws like that into effect. But there have been animal rights activists for like 400 years or so. Mostly now, though, in the last 60 years, which is why it would be something like vegan propaganda out there. But it's interesting because it does take a different tack than other documentaries, Cowspiracy like it, because it's not taking up animal rights. That's touched on, but the primary pitch that's being made to you as the viewer is not to eat animal products for the planet, for the climate. The planet more generally, because he talks a lot about like industrial runoff from fertilizers and things like that. But that's different than animal rights. And if you want another reason not to, Kip Anderson has a follow-up, which I think is still on Netflix. And that film, his second film, and I'll tell you in a minute, it's a trilogy, but the second film is called What the Health? Not What the Hell, but What the Health. And he takes another tact. And again, it's not animal rights. So you can do it for animal rights, you can do it for the planet, but in What the Health, he argues, do it for yourself, because eating animal products is just unhealthy. And he goes into all the health problems, things like I said about your shortening your lifespan by eating beef and all. So, and if you're interested, he has a third in what became a trilogy, which is not Cowspiracy, but Seaspiracy, SEA. And that is if you decided that if you saw, well, I won't eat any this industrial produced meat, I will eat, fish instead. Kip Anderson will tell you the problem there. And the fact is we've decimated our oceans now, and it's no longer possible for our oceans to sustain the population that we have. And the other final one, just to give you, I mean, you can see there are different approaches to why you would want to eat largely plant-based diet. And social justice is one that I've talked about, and that could be separate from your personal health, the health of the planet, or the health of the animals involved, but the health of other people on the planet. If humans consumed the crops that we give animals to eat, like corn and soybeans, the world's food supply would be enriched by about 70%, which is absolutely huge. And that would support another 4 billion people. So if you follow those two numbers I've said in the last 10 minutes, if we didn't waste as much food as we do, we could feed another 3 billion people. If we decided to not have animals and just eat the food that we grow ourselves, that would feed 4 billion people. Together, 7 billion people, almost the world population. And if the WHO is right and population does cap out at about 12 billion, we have no problem with the food system on this planet in that regard, although we may want to change it for other reasons. And of course, you may want to do this. You may want to eat a largely plant-based diet for intersectional reasons. In other words, you might care about animals, you might care about the planet, you might care about your health, you might care about other people. And in that case, it's a win-win-win-win solution. So. So next comment, returning to the comment that in the observation that Cowspiracy did not show some gruesome videos from slaughterhouses, the decision to do so may have stemmed from the fact that animal rights were not the focus of the documentary. Instead, the horrific consequences that we saw generally had to do with how our planet and its climate are being harmed. The film Cowspiracy immediately made me think back to the steakhouse where I went that had a sign saying, "Hey, vegetarians, stop eating my food's food." After watching the film, that slogan is even more ridiculous to me, because if we used this food's food to feed human beings, we could feed so many people using a lot less resources, such as land and water. Seeing how much water is used to produce beef upset me, because I had recently learned about environmental injustice in California that makes it so hard for a lot of people that don't have access to clean running water. So it's a long comment, but a good comment, because it draws attention to the fact that this issue is not just about climate. An enormous amount of water goes into producing food that we eat. In fact, I mentioned before Renan Leroux, who is a professor in the French department, his goal is to make UCSB a entirely plant-based campus. Argued that as much water as we use here, so we get our water from the water treatment plant across from the airport, and on some months when it's dry, we use as much as 80 million gallons of water per month at UCSB. But if you run the numbers, the amount of beef and meat that we consume at UCSB probably rivals that. And places like, thousands of gallons of water are being used indirectly for places like, the subway over in the Arbor there. So, so I just want to be clear before walking away from this is not just a climate issue. In that sense, it's another win-win, because it's climate, but also the other environmental problems, like using too much water by having industrial runoff, agricultural runoff. And if you saw Cowspiracy, then like in the Gulf of Mexico and all, it's absolutely huge. And this is a local issue here, because California is the number 3 country, number 3 state in the U.S. for having the most livestock. So if you rank them, I think, as you might imagine, Texas is number 1. California is number 3. And actually, we have more milk cows. So we're not done yet, folks. We have like minutes to go. We have more milk cows than any other state in the United States. So that also underscores something. You may know that water is becoming this commodity across the planet. We have plenty of fresh water, enough for everyone across the planet. Distribution is an issue, but also we're using so much of it to feed this global herd of 70 billion animals that we have. So, yeah, let me just see. Okay, just jump to the end. How useful did you find the documentary that you watched this week? And by that, I mean either Cowspiracy or Wasted. Trying to get a feel for it. And then you can go. Okay. Again, most people found it pretty useful.